Yes, I gotta work on my witty one-liners. All right. I was 13 when I announced to my parents at the dinner table that I wanted to be a forensic scientist. Forks dropped, mouths opened, followed by looks of horror. My mom finally asked, "Honey, isn't that dead people?" My parents had no idea how they raised a scientist since they were both accountants. Up until that point, I wanted to be a movie star, just like any other kid. But on June 17th, 1994, O.J. Simpson was pursued by the LAPD in his white Bronco. He raced down that freeway and changed my life forever. I was captivated by the trial and was introduced to forensic scientists like Dr. Michael Baden, Dr. Henry Lee, and Dr. Frederick Reeders on the television. These men fascinated me. I couldn't believe you could find out so much information with such microscopic evidence. I needed to know more, and I pored over books in the library and eventually turned to the Discovery and the Learning Channel for answers. And I found a television show called Medical Detectives, which back in those days had a parental advisory and would only air after 10 p.m. And I would sneak out of my room every week into our living room so that I could catch the latest episode. When my parents caught me sneaking out of my room late at night to watch a science show, they decided to let it be. The rest of the town thought I was this ghoulish child fascinated by death. But once CSI came out in 2000, it was safe to move Medical Detectives to primetime with the fancier name Forensic Files. And after that show, I no longer was the morbid kid, but the coolest person in town. A few years later, I graduated with a Bachelor of Science degree in chemistry with a concentration in forensic science. But before I moved to graduate school to study forensic science, I stuck around my college town and did all I could to spread the word of science to the young women in the community. I volunteered for the Advocates for Women in Science, Engineering, and Math, also known as AWSEM, and was put in charge of mentoring 5 high school-aged girls. The only problem was that I never taught before, and there was no experienced assistant to help me out. I was left alone with these girls every Saturday for 4 weeks. During the first class, I was terribly nervous, and the girls didn't seem to be that interested and were bored very easily. I didn't know what to do. And my class was interrupted when an older man walked in, followed by this really, really young girl. And he wondered if it was all right if she could join the class. She was only 13, but he assured me that she was really smart for her age and could follow along with the advanced material. "No problem, welcome," I said. "More the merrier." Her young, sweet face looked up at me in awe, and she boosted my confidence to keep going as the other girls yawned. So there was this point, as I was trying to explain the beauty of chromatography using coffee filters and M&Ms, where I realized I was just not getting through to these girls. So I had a backup plan. I announced, "Okay, fine. Let's go outside and dump some Mentos in these Coke bottles." And I plopped the bottles on the desk, making this loud thud, and they perked right up. So I spent the rest of the hour creating giant Diet Coke explosions. And I was happy to see smiles on these girls' faces for once. The lesson for that day was, even though science can get really boring sometimes, when all else fails, you can just blow something up. The next experiment was an absolute disaster. To impress them, I broke into the university chemistry lab the night before and borrowed some supplies. I wanted to create a galvanic cell, and so I borrowed sodium chloride, copper sulfate, zinc sulfate, along with pieces of zinc and copper and some string to create a salt bridge. I also bought these tiny light bulbs at the hardware store. My goal was to teach them about oxidation and reduction, all while being super awesome and creating electricity. At least that's what I saw in my dreams. The girls clapping and gasping in awe as I created light. There was no electricity. Out of frustration, I grabbed the anode and cathode of my failed experiment, giving myself a decent shock. I began squealing as the current flowed through me. The girls did laugh, although I'm sure they were also terrified. On the final week, I was convinced I was a failure. None of my experiments were working, and I feared they would walk out of the program believing science was for losers. Even the 13-year-old's faith in me was starting to wane. I refused to give up. I was going to make that final class count. I went right back into the lab, pleaded for help to my former chemistry professor, and left with a cart full of hot plates, graduated cylinders, and SIR rods. I was going to make that dinky classroom look like a laboratory. I even borrowed some lab coats so they could look like real scientists. And I did the experiment the night before to make sure it actually worked. They walked into the classroom the next day with curious looks on their faces. I stood in the center of the room in my lab coat and announced, "Today, ladies, we're going to be extracting DNA from wheat germ." Unfortunately, there was one thing that I didn't realize the night before. I was so determined to make sure that the experiment worked, I didn't realize what the final product looked like. I should have seen it since I was a college student with a dirty mind. The end result is this milky white goo. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It looked like semen. And I watched in horror as these girls played with it between their fingers. They held it up to each other's faces and some sniffed it. The 13-year-old was truly inspired. She put her specimen in a tissue for preservation. She couldn't wait to show her father as soon as he walked through the door. I tried to talk her out of it. I said, "He won't understand. It's all about the process. I hope you learned something. That's all that matters," as I held out a trash can. She protected her wheat germ jizz tight in her hand. She was proud of her little creation. Her eyes lit up when she saw her father. "Look, Daddy, look what I extracted." The father asked, "Oh, honey, how did you do that?" "Oh, Daddy, it was easy. First, all you need is some meat tenderizer." She turned to me with her pure heart and asked, "What was the soap for? A lubricant?" "It's a detergent. A detergent." But she looked up at me and said, "Oh, thank you." No, thank you. I hope you learned something and had fun too." She turned to her father and said, "I want to be a scientist just like her." Her father didn't have a dirty mind like me, and he was so happy. And that's when I realized that I was this girl's Dr. Henry Lee, and was inspiring her to grow up to be a scientist just like me.
That's Darlene's last 10x9 story. Thank you, Darlene. Wow, was that awkward? Oh my gosh. What? All right, we're going to take a 10-minute break. Laura Rogers, if you're here, please come see me at the front. We'll be back.